Welcome to Uncovered Biblical History and Traditions, the channel dedicated to lost stories of the biblical past. Discover stories of pre-Christian historical roots, biblical legends, lost church history, and forgotten historical characters of faith. It is very helpful if you hit the like, subscribe, and share. Help build my channel, and let's take a look together into these uncovered forgotten tales. Imagine this: you're standing in the early morning mist on Salisbury Plain, surrounded by massive stone sentinels that have watched over the English countryside for 4,000 years. These aren't just rocks, they're time machines, holding secrets that have driven historians mad for centuries. Today we're diving deep into one of archaeology's most controversial theories about Stonehenge. What if I told you that this iconic British monument wasn't built by Druids, Romans, or even lost Atlanteans, but by ancient Hebrew migrants following a trail of stone monuments that stretches from the Persian Gulf to the shores of Britain? Today, we're exploring a theory so audacious, so well documented, yet so overlooked by mainstream archaeology, that it could rewrite everything we thought we knew about ancient Britain. This is the story of the lost builders of Stonehenge. For millennia, the ancient world knew this place by a different name, the location of the hanging stones, or suspended stones. Unlike so many other archaeological sites that crumbled under the weight of centuries, Stonehenge has performed what can only be described as a miraculous act of endurance. 4,000 years of British weather, the howling winds, the driving rains, the freeze-thaw cycles that reduce mountains to pebbles, have barely touched these megalithic giants. But here's what's truly remarkable: while Stonehenge survived nature's assault, it completely defeated human understanding. By the 12th century AD, the monument had become so thoroughly mysterious that scholars, historians, and storytellers began weaving increasingly elaborate tales to explain its existence. The truth had been lost so completely that humanity was forced to invent new truths to fill the void. The earliest recorded explanation sounds like something from a fantasy novel. Medieval chroniclers claimed that Merlin the wizard had used his supernatural powers to construct Stonehenge as a memorial to several hundred British princes who had been massacred in a great battle. This wasn't just idle speculation; serious historians of the time presented this as factual history. But as the Renaissance brought new scholarship, theorists began looking to more earthly builders. By the late 17th century, Stonehenge had been attributed to virtually every advanced ancient civilization imaginable. The Greeks, with their architectural mastery, were natural candidates. The Romans, with their engineering prowess and British occupation, seemed logical. The seafaring Phoenicians and the mysterious Danes all had their advocates. Yet the 19th century brought an explosion of theories so wild, so creative, that they make modern conspiracy theories look tame by comparison. In the mid-1800s, a man named Henry Brown from Amesbury published what might be the most audacious archaeological theory ever committed to paper. His article bore a title that was almost longer than some academic papers: an unprejudicial, authentic, and interesting account which that stupendous and beautiful edifice Stonehenge, in Wiltshire, is found to give of itself. Brown's theory was breathtaking in its scope. Stonehenge had been erected during the days of Adam, the very first human, and had been knocked down by Noah's flood. His evidence: the monument's current state of ruin was concentrated on the southwest side, exactly where the waters of the biblical deluge would have struck first as they advanced across the landscape. But Brown's flood theory was just the beginning. In 1883, researcher W.S. Blackett proposed that Stonehenge's builders weren't from Earth at all, at least, not from any known earthly civilization. They were, he claimed, survivors from the lost continent of Atlantis. The following year, T.A. Wise added another layer to the mystery, suggesting that Stonehenge had originally been constructed as sacred, high places for Druidic worship, but had later fallen under the control of Buddhist missionaries who transformed it into an Eastern spiritual center in the heart of ancient Britain. Perhaps the most scholarly of these Victorian theories came from Professor A.T. Evans, who proposed in 1889 that Stonehenge represented an advanced form of burial architecture where ancestor worship had merged with Celtic religious practices, creating a temple where the dead were venerated alongside nature gods represented by sacred oak trees. By the early 20th century, archaeologists recognized that centuries of creative speculation had failed to unlock Stonehenge's secrets. The monument had successfully resisted every attempt at explanation, from Arthurian legend to lost civilizations. Only systematic, objective archaeological investigation could solve what researchers now called this ancient British riddle. When scientists finally began applying rigorous methodology to Stonehenge, they made a startling discovery. The monument wasn't unique. It was part of a vast network of stone structures that formed a trail across thousands of miles and thousands of years. Imagine a treasure map drawn not on paper, but across the landscape of 3 continents. Starting in the districts north of the Persian Gulf, archaeologists traced a remarkable pattern: stone circles, standing stones, and burial mounds forming an unmistakable westward migration route spanning 3,000 to 4,000 years. This wasn't a random scattering of similar structures. The monuments showed consistent architectural principles, construction techniques, and ceremonial purposes. The trail ran both north and south of the Mediterranean, converging on the Atlantic coasts of Western Europe before splitting again, one branch heading north through Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, another terminating in the British Isles. The builders had left behind 3 distinct types of monuments, each with Celtic names that hint at their original purposes. Menhirs, high stones, were solitary standing stones that commemorated great events or important individuals. Dolmens, table stones, consisted of massive horizontal slabs balanced on multiple vertical supports, creating megalithic tables for unknown ceremonies. And cromlechs, stone circles, were circular arrangements of standing stones, often enclosing burial mounds or dolmen structures. Stonehenge represented the pinnacle of cromlech architecture, a highly specialized, incredibly sophisticated version of the basic stone circle concept. The trail led to a shocking realization. The greatest concentrations of megalithic structures weren't found in Celtic lands or Roman territories, but in regions associated with ancient Hebrew civilization. The lands of biblical Israel, Central Asia, and especially the Trans-Jordanian territories contained some of the most extensive megalithic fields ever discovered. More intriguingly, these monuments matched perfectly with detailed descriptions found throughout the Hebrew Bible. The scriptures didn't just mention stone monuments, they provided construction manuals, religious purposes, and historical contexts that aligned precisely with archaeological discoveries. Consider Jacob's famous dream at Bethel, where he used a stone as a pillow and afterward took the stone that he had put under his head, set it up as a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. He renamed the location Bethel, meaning God's house. Later, when making a covenant with his father-in-law Laban, Jacob again took a stone and set it up as a pillar, then instructed his relatives to gather stones, creating both a standing stone witness and a communal cairn. Moses, following this tradition, built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. The Mosaic Law specifically provided for the construction of altars from unhewn stones, natural rocks untouched by human tools, examples of which still exist throughout the Holy Land. Perhaps most significantly, the prophet Jeremiah gave specific instructions to the scattered tribes of Israel during their migrations: set up road signs, put up guideposts. Make note of the highway, the road that you take. The Hebrew words translated as road signs and guideposts literally mean stone heaps and high stones, precisely the megalithic monuments found along the archaeological trail from the Middle East to Western Europe. Archaeological dating reveals that stone monuments appeared along the migration routes between 700 BC and 500 AD, exactly the period when historical records document Hebrew tribal movements through Scythia, Central Europe, and westward. The monuments weren't just random markers, they were waypoints, tribal memories cast in stone, preserving both navigation aids and cultural identity across generations of migration. The biblical account corroborates this archaeological evidence with remarkable precision. Joshua's 12-stone monument at the Jordan River crossing, Samuel's Ebenezer stone near Mitzpah, and Absalom's memorial pillar all represent the same tradition that archaeologists trace across continents. When researchers analyzed the convergent evidence, archaeological, linguistic, biblical, and geographical, a remarkable picture emerged. The original colonists who brought megalithic architecture to Britain appear to have originated from Acadia, the fertile southern province of Babylonia watered by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This was the ancient land of the Chaldeans, where the descendants of Shem, father of the children of Heber, known as the Hebrews, settled after the Great Flood. The stone monuments of Britain, including Stonehenge itself, may represent the final flowering of an ancient Hebrew tradition that began with descendants of Shem, then to Abraham's altars, continued through Jacob's pillars, was codified in Moses' law, and carried by migrating tribes across thousands of miles and thousands of years until it reached the misty shores of prehistoric Britain. Picture this: you're standing in the shadow of Stonehenge at dawn, watching the sun align perfectly with those massive stone trilithons. For centuries, we've wondered who built this marvel, how they moved those colossal blocks, and why they possessed such precise astronomical knowledge. But what if I told you that the answer lies not in the misty prehistory of Britain, but in the ancient libraries of Babylon, the star charts of Chaldean priests, and a forgotten migration that rewrote the map of human civilization? Today we're diving into one of the most controversial theories in archaeology, the idea that Stonehenge and Britain's megalithic monuments weren't built by primitive Neolithic farmers, but by the descendants of the world's first astronomers, carrying knowledge that stretches back to before the Great Flood itself. Let's begin with a puzzle that has confounded archaeologists for generations. When researchers first studied the ancient Chaldean civilization in Mesopotamia, they discovered something extraordinary. These people, living thousands of years ago, possessed astronomical knowledge that seemed impossibly advanced for their time. The Chaldeans knew the exact length of the solar year. They divided the day into 24 hours and the circle into 360 degrees, measurements we still use today. They calculated eclipses with stunning accuracy, compiled extensive lists of celestial events, and even discovered that the sun had spots on its surface. They recognized comets, understood the 12 signs of the zodiac, and possessed mathematical values related to the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon so complex that it requires observations spanning multiple generations. But here's where it gets truly mysterious. The Chaldeans had the formulas and methods for these calculations, but they didn't seem to understand the underlying principles that made them work. It was as if they had inherited a sophisticated instruction manual written in a language they could only partially read. This brings us to our first explosive claim, that this advanced knowledge wasn't developed by the Chaldeans at all, but inherited from a much earlier civilization. According to this theory, the original astronomers were the descendants of what ancient texts call the Adamic race, a people who originated in Central Asia and spread across the world in great migrations that lasted for centuries before a catastrophic flood changed everything. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote that the Sethites were the inventors of that peculiar sort of wisdom which is concerned with the heavenly bodies and their order. Ancient Persian and Arabian traditions consistently attribute the invention of astronomy to biblical figures like Adam, Seth, and Enoch. The non-canonical Book of Jubilees describes Enoch as the first one among the children of men that are born on the earth to learn writing and knowledge and wisdom, who wrote the signs of heaven according to the order of their months in a book. These weren't just creation myths or religious allegories. According to the theory we're exploring, they were historical accounts of real people who possessed genuine astronomical knowledge thousands of years before conventional history suggests such knowledge existed. Now, here's where our story takes a dramatic turn. After the flood, dated by biblical chronologist Dr. Adam Rutherford to 3145 BC, survivors carrying this ancient astronomical knowledge began to migrate again. One particular branch of this family tree became crucial to our story, the descendants of Eber, whose name literally means colonizer in the Hebrew-Phoenician language. These Hebrew-Phoenicians became, according to historical records, the greatest colonizers and mariners in the ancient world. Starting from their base in Chaldea, they migrated to Phoenicia on the Mediterranean coast, and from there, they spread in all directions. But this wasn't random wandering. These were organized expeditions led by people who understood navigation, astronomy, and advanced engineering. Some of these groups became the ancestors of the United Kingdom of Israel, all 13 tribes, not just the tribe of Judah that many associate with modern Israel. Others migrated westward across Europe and Africa, heading toward Western Europe and what ancient texts call the Isles in the West. And here's the kicker: wherever they went, they left calling cards. Massive stone monuments that required advanced engineering knowledge and astronomical precision to construct. This is where our story intersects with British archaeology in a way that will make you see Stonehenge completely differently. According to this theory, the people that modern historians call the Neolithic inhabitants of Britain weren't primitive farmers slowly developing their culture. They were Hebrew-Phoenician colonists carrying thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. The evidence. Consider what Sir Norman Lockyer, a brilliant British astronomer, discovered when he studied Stonehenge and other British stone monuments astronomically. He concluded that these structures were built by people with sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics, people he identified as Phoenician Hebrew colonists who arrived around the time of Abraham. Lockyer specifically noted that Avebury, another massive stone circle, was likely the first great temple of Britain, made by the first Phoenician Hebrew colony that came hither. They chose that particular location, he argued, because of the convenient grey weather stones that were perfect for their astronomical purposes. But wait, there's more. Professor L.A. Waddell, in his work, Phoenician Origin of the Britons, Scots and Anglo-Saxons, documented hundreds of Phoenician coins and inscriptions found throughout Britain and the East. These artifacts suggest that the early Britons weren't just influenced by Phoenician culture, they were the same sea-going people whose astronomer priests built devices to study the heavens. Think about the implications. What if the windmill people and beaker people, archaeological cultures that historians say followed the Neolithic period, weren't separate waves of primitive migration, but later groups of Hebrew-Phoenician colonists following established routes? These later arrivals, coming through Africa, Spain, Greece, and Crete, eventually fused with the earlier settlers to form what we know as the Wessex culture. The individual groups varied so much that archaeologists can't speak of a single, megalithic people, but they can identify a consistent megalithic culture, a sophisticated approach to astronomy, engineering, and social organization that these colonists imposed on the native populations they encountered. Here's perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this theory: these weren't just skilled builders or navigators. They maintained a class of astronomer priests who combined religious authority with scientific knowledge. These priests built sophisticated observational devices and maintained the astronomical traditions they had inherited from their ancestors. This explains why megalithic monuments across Britain and Europe show such precise astronomical alignments. Stonehenge's famous alignment with the summer solstice sunrise isn't a lucky accident or the result of centuries of trial and error. It's the work of people who already knew exactly how to calculate celestial events and encode that knowledge in stone. This theory completely revolutionizes our understanding of ancient British history. Instead of a slow, gradual development from hunter-gatherers to farmers to monument builders, we have skilled astronomer colonists arriving with advanced knowledge and immediately beginning sophisticated construction projects. The Chaldean connection explains why these monuments demonstrate mathematical and astronomical knowledge that seems far too advanced for their supposed time period. The Hebrew-Phoenician migration explains why similar megalithic cultures appeared across such vast geographic areas, from the Mediterranean to the British Isles. When we look at Stonehenge today, we're not just seeing the remnants of a mysterious prehistoric culture. According to this theory, we're looking at the achievement of people whose intellectual heritage stretched back through thousands of years of accumulated knowledge that included precise astronomical calculations, advanced mathematics, and sophisticated engineering techniques. The precision of Stonehenge's construction, the complexity of its astronomical alignments, and the engineering required to transport and position those massive stones suddenly makes sense when we consider that its builders weren't starting from scratch. They were applying knowledge systems that had been refined over millennia. This theory suggests that what we call prehistoric Britain was actually connected to a vast network of related cultures stretching from Mesopotamia to the Atlantic. The Hebrew Phoenicians weren't just traders or colonists, they were the inheritors and preservers of humanity's earliest scientific achievements. The knowledge preserved in their astronomical traditions, their mathematical systems, and their monumental architecture represents a direct link to civilizations that existed before the Great Flood that reshaped the ancient world. When they built Stonehenge and the other megalithic monuments, they weren't just creating impressive structures, they were encoding thousands of years of human knowledge in stone, ensuring it would survive even if their civilization didn't. Imagine this: you're standing in the shadow of Stonehenge at dawn, watching the sun rise through those massive stone trilithons. Now imagine traveling 3,000 miles east to the highlands of Tibet, where another circle of ancient stones catches that same sunrise. Then journey to the deserts of Sinai, where stone structures identical to Scottish Highland homes dot the landscape. What if these aren't coincidences, but breadcrumbs left by a single, extraordinary civilization that spanned continents and millennia? Today, we're diving into one of archaeology's most controversial theories, the idea that Stonehenge's builders weren't Celtic Druids, but Hebrew migrants carrying ancient Egyptian knowledge across the world. Our story begins in 1913 with Sir Grafton Elliot Smith, an Australian anthropologist whose radical paper shook British archaeology's foundations. Smith wasn't content studying Britain's megalithic monuments in isolation. Instead, he cast his gaze across the Mediterranean to Egypt, where he made a startling observation. The massive stone burial chambers scattered across British countryside bore an uncanny resemblance to Egypt's mastabas, the flat-topped burial monuments that preceded the Great Pyramids. Smith traced these similarities to the early 3rd millennium BC, when Egyptian civilization was reaching new architectural heights. Sir Mortimer Wheeler, a Harvard University professor, examined Smith's findings and reached his own conclusion. The general analogy between mastabas and many types of chambered tomb, Wheeler wrote, is too close to be altogether accidental. This wasn't just similar-looking stones, it suggested identical construction techniques and shared engineering principles spanning civilizations. Most intriguingly, Smith discovered that ancient British builders weren't using their own measurement system, they were using the Royal Egyptian cubit, the precise standard employed in pyramid construction. This wasn't cultural influence, it suggested direct knowledge transmission from Egypt to Britain. While Smith revolutionized thinking about burial chambers, another mystery demanded attention: Avebury. Often overshadowed by Stonehenge, Avebury dwarfs its famous neighbor in both age and scale, representing perhaps the most ambitious stone circle project ever attempted in prehistoric Europe. The statistics are staggering. Avebury consists of 3 circles in complex arrangement. 2 inner circles, measuring 325 and 350 feet in diameter, sit within a massive outer ring spanning 1,260 feet across. The stones themselves were massive unhewn sarcens, each weighing 70 to 80 tons. The entire complex was surrounded by an earthwork that defied prehistoric understanding, a sophisticated fortification standing 44 feet high and stretching a full mile in circumference. The engineering required suggested organizational capability and technical knowledge that seemed impossible for supposedly primitive, prehistoric inhabitants. For decades, archaeologists couldn't find any comparable structure worldwide. Avebury seemed unique, until researchers expanded their search beyond Europe. Near Darab in ancient Persia, they found Avebury's twin. The construction was identical, same massive scale, sophisticated engineering, and precise astronomical alignments. 2 circles, separated by thousands of miles and different cultures, built according to identical blueprints. The mystery deepened when Professor G. N. Roerich, exploring Tibet's remote highlands for trails to inmost Asia, discovered something extraordinary. In lands later famous for Buddhist monasteries, Roerich found evidence of a much older civilization speaking the same architectural language as Britain's stone circle builders. The site was called De Ring, meaning the lone stone. 18 rows of stone slabs stood in perfect alignment, each oriented precisely east to west. At each alignment's western end stood a cromlech, circular arrangements of standing stones virtually identical to British stone circles. The Tibetan builders had incorporated crude stone altars positioned before their standing stones, creating what Roerich identified as a sanctuary for some primitive cult. The complex dated to Tibet's pre-Buddhist period. When Roerich compared his discovery to Karnak's famous alignments in Brittany, he found what he described as precisely the same arrangement. The Karnak stones, like the Tibetan counterparts, were organized in east to west alignments terminating in stone circles. Here were megalithic monuments on opposite ends of Earth's largest continent, separated by thousands of forbidding miles, yet built according to identical principles. Sometimes the most revealing evidence comes from humble architecture. In 1873, the Palestine exploration team surveying the Sinai Peninsula made a discovery that added another intercontinental puzzle piece. Scattered across the desert were hundreds of small stone structures locals called nawamas, literally, mosquito houses. Tradition held these were built by Israel's children during wilderness wanderings as protection against desert insects. The expedition might have dismissed this as folklore, except these structures were architecturally identical to buildings found thousands of miles away in Scotland. The Nawamis were circular stone houses, approximately 10 feet in diameter, constructed entirely of unhewn stone using sophisticated dry stone masonry. Each featured a carefully engineered dome-shaped roof crowned by a single large capstone. Walls were reinforced with precisely placed stones to prevent outward bulging, and each had a standardized low entrance exactly 2 feet high. The expedition recognized this design. They had seen identical structures in Scotland's Shetland Islands, known as Bothan or Sheelings. The same design appeared near Inverness at Clava. Construction methods, proportions, and engineering solutions were virtually indistinguishable across these vastly separated locations. Perhaps the most provocative connection came from Sir Henry Morton Stanley, the famous British explorer. Investigating ancient Palestinian sites, Stanley documented a stone circle atop Mount Gerizim, which he identified as the Mount of God. This was, according to Stanley, the oldest sanctuary in Palestine, with design nearly identical with the so-called Druidic circles of Britain. The religious significance was profound. Mount Gerizim was where, according to biblical tradition, Melchizedek, the mysterious priest of the Most High God, had emerged from a stone circle to meet Abraham, bearing bread and wine. Here Abraham received blessings and promises that, as Stanley noted, have been so literally fulfilled. This suggested the stone circle tradition wasn't merely architectural, it was fundamentally religious, representing sacred space connecting the British Isles to Hebrew religious tradition's very foundations. As researchers assembled these scattered evidence pieces, a remarkable picture emerged. The architectural parallels, precision, construction techniques, consistency across vast distances, and key sites' religious significance all pointed toward an extraordinary conclusion: Britain's megalithic monument builders were either Hebrews themselves or Hebrew ancestors. This wasn't about cultural influence or trade relationships. The evidence suggested direct migration of what biblical tradition called the building race, descended from Shem and credited with constructing Egypt's Great Pyramid. Groups of these master builders had been moving westward for millennia, carrying accumulated architectural wisdom. The journey took them from Egypt's great building projects, where they perfected techniques, through the Middle East where they established sites like Mount Gerizim, across Central Asia where they marked Tibet, and finally to the British Isles, where their knowledge culminated in Stonehenge and Avebury construction. This wasn't a single exodus but gradual movement spanning centuries. Each generation pushed further west, carrying forward ancestors' sacred knowledge, building techniques, measurement systems, astronomical knowledge, and religious traditions that became woven into Western civilization's foundations. This theory's implications extend far beyond archaeology. If correct, it suggests humanity's most impressive prehistoric achievements weren't isolated primitive societies' work, but the product of a sophisticated, far-flung civilization with advanced engineering, astronomy, and mathematical knowledge. The Royal Egyptian cubit in British monuments, identical construction techniques spanning continents, consistent east to west orientations from Tibet to Brittany, all point toward prehistoric organization and knowledge transfer that challenges fundamental assumptions about ancient capabilities. Whether one accepts this theory or not, the evidence demands explanation. How did identical architectural solutions emerge independently across such distances? How did prehistoric builders achieve such precision without modern surveying tools? Why do these monuments' religious traditions show remarkable consistency across different cultures and continents? The stone builders left us a mystery written in granite and sarsen, in precisely aligned rows and carefully measured circles. Their legacy stands not just in monuments they built, but in questions they force us to ask about our prehistoric world's sophistication and interconnectedness. If you would like further context and the rest of the story, check out previous videos and future videos. If you would like more information where to research this subject, pause this image and look into these resources or find resources in description. If you have book sources or links of your own on this subject, please share in comments or email me. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this forgotten biblical story. Leave a like, comment, share and subscribe. This is very helpful. Join me next time for another lost story of our biblical history. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe for more great content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.